Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday morning. I am Emily McIntosh here with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources to talk to you about a very exciting and very interesting topic. We are here to talk about the Green Book. As you may or may not know, there's a movie coming out this weekend called Green Book. Very interesting, very exciting, and we are here to talk to some historians, some curators, some experts about exactly what the Green Book is. So if you all could introduce yourselves to the lovely people at home.
Good morning. My name is Natalie Rodriguez. I am the field intern for the Green Book Project. I went to North Carolina Central undergrad, and now I attend North Carolina State for public history.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Withers. I currently serve as the research historian for the Oasis Spaces Green Book Project that is currently being facilitated by the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
And good morning. My name is Earl Imes, and I'm one of the curators at the North Carolina Museum of History.
Thank you all so much for joining me today and bringing your expertise and knowledge to talk about, like I said, this very interesting topic of the Green Book. So there are some people at home who may not be familiar exactly with what the Green Book is or don't know very much about this particular time period in history. So who can get us started on talking exactly about, for those of us, or for some people who don't know at home, what is the Green Book?
I can
Lisa,
jump in with that.
Yeah, Lisa, please tell us.
So the Green Book essentially was a publication, oftentimes referred to as a travel guide. It was published specifically for African American who are navigating in spaces that are unfamiliar to them. For example, so for the family from North Carolina who may be going to, say, Alabama, they could use the Green Book to identify where are hotels or motels they could stay in that would be welcoming to them. They could refer to the Green Book to identify restaurants or even gas stations where they may be able to do the things that you often think about considering need to be done while on a trip, and do so in a manner that was safe, because we are talking about racial segregation, and there's the understanding now that not everywhere an individual went was considered a safe space for them or a place where you can carry out everyday business. And so essentially the Green Book was a travel guide, and even the original author, Victor Green, he essentially said that it was a guide intended to help African Americans to avoid the embarrassment that often came as a part of their life with Jim Crow and racial segregation.
So interesting. And so obviously, due to the Civil Rights Act, this Green Book doesn't exist anymore. Is that right? So talk a little bit more about that. Like, how does this, talk about modern day as far as the Green Book is concerned?
So with the Green Book and thinking about legislation that has since passed, Victor Green, when he published the first Green Book in 1936, he definitely said that he was publishing in hopes that one day it would no longer be necessary. And so there was clearly a vision from the very start in the 1930s that one day how we operate in society would get to such a place where everyone, regardless of the color of your skin, your creed, whatever parameters you may like to say, would not be something that you have to cross your mind and be mindful of where you went and where you went to. And so yes, the Green Book did cease publication in the 1960s. The last edition was published in 1966. Okay. And so right after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Earl, if you want to add?
And this is also important because this is during the rise of automobile culture in America, and the rise of our modern interstate highways, and those all being administered in many cases by the federal government. Of course, we have here in our state an old state road system that's administered by the state highway department of the Department of Transportation, which actually regulated segregated travel within the state of North Carolina back during this time frame, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, until, as you say, our 1964 Civil Rights Act and along that line. This is necessary, mandatory, because there were segregated places that were sundown towns, for an example, that it was illegal for people of color to be there. And how would you know that if you didn't have that information? And as a quick kind of allusion to the movie, I had the opportunity to preview it, and there is a scene in the film where they are actually caught in a sundown town. And so this is very real back then, and your life it would hang in the balance. But on the other side, their Green Book also advertised amenities like tailors, which are very important, in particular in African American community, style and fashion traveling and luxury style as best as possible. So you see, for an example, in Green Book's tailors who are being advertised in many of these places, in addition to the restaurants or hotels and other places that are places for safe stop.
Interesting. So it is not only a guide for people to know where they can stop for places like, you know, where to eat or where to use the restroom, where to stay at a hotel, but also for certain amenities and certain services as well. Very interesting.
Yes.
So we had some people submit some questions to us. Thank you all for submitting us questions. We got some really good ones, and I have them here with me, so I'm going to bring them up and ask them to you, these beautiful experts. So Jessica on Facebook asked a couple of very good questions. We talked a little bit about the different things that were in the Green Book, such as amenities or services, and also locations that you could go to. But is there a brief, more comprehensive list? The question here is what all was listed in the Green Book. So I guess you could say everything you could imagine?
Well, not necessarily. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, what I was gonna say is our project is focused on North Carolina, so I'm gonna speak in regards to North Carolina.
Perfect.
But we have. Sorry, the question was: is there a comprehensive list? Of
Just what all was inside the Green Book.
So you would have, as we said earlier, tailors, barbershops. You would have gas stations, rest stops. You would also have tourist homes or boarding homes for a lot of individuals and family, which is really interesting because a lot of these boarding homes or tourist homes were owned by African Americans in the community, so they obviously saw that need and they met that need for people to have a space to sleep and rest.
Yeah.
There was a lot of different things like that in that regards. Those are the things we've come across thus far, and I personally have come across in my research. But yeah, so you have these different amenities. Actually, we have one of them I've seen the YMCA too. So you have a lot of different recreational uses as well. So yeah.
And this is the perfect segue into our next question. Hannah on Facebook asked, did the Green Book give advice or recommendations about arts and entertainment options?
Yes, they did. They had editorials sometimes in the beginning of their books on like great destination spots. They would have suggestions on how to travel. Sometimes in certain editions in the Green Book, you'll see like at the bottom of the page, it will say like make sure you. It'll give you some type of advice. So it didn't just offer these places; it also offered advice in regards to traveling for African Americans.
Great.
Well, and also to continue that, Emily, the Green Book was not exclusive to African American and people of color. Many Jewish merchants advertised in the Green Book. And here in Raleigh, for an example, there's Mr. Snakenberg, who was right downtown in Raleigh here, who advertised in the Green Book because the segregated African American community comprised a very viable economic demographic. And in many respects, part of the reason that contributed toward desegregation and integration is because of that very viable market that were in these segregated communities. So it was a very good business move to advertise in the Green Book. But along that line, and to talk about that, we brought a Green Book that's on loan from the Museum
of
History. One of the patrons and who's going to be participating in our annual African American Cultural Celebration has graciously loaned a Green Book that we have for our project, a 1959 edition.
Wow.
And I think it was Hannah who asked the question, what is in the Green Book? And a lot of it depends on the issue. And in this case, this is a, can you see that? Okay.
There you go.
There you go. This is a 1959 version.
Wow.
And of course it advertises places throughout the country, not only in the South. It's important and imperative for our listeners to know that that this was advertised across America. And so in this 1959 version, there is, at the back a Fox Creek Motel and Resort that's in Pacific, Missouri.
Interesting.
Obviously this is a higher end amenity, so to speak. You would think advertised as a resort, but to that end, this is some of the other amenities. But if you open it up, one thing that we like to talk about is how it's broken in by states. And so if we go to North Carolina, let's see it.
And this is perfect segueing into my next question: is if the Green Book is somehow, if there's different books for each state, or if it's one book for across the entire country. And so as we'll see here, it'll be designated by each state.
So, there are, for various editions, you see a growth in who's included within each Green Book, but they are, in this case, this book is divided by each state, and then it will be a county too.
Oh, interesting.
So, or county or city.
City and town.
City. And so right now, if we looked at North Carolina and we want to find like places in Raleigh, we could do that, and we'll have a list of places with their addresses. Sometimes not a complete address, and that's what we realized. One thing we realized in our research is that also some things may be spelled incorrectly in the Green Book as well.
Or if you want to bring it a little more towards the center, I think we'll get.
Yeah, can you see it there? Okay. And you can see for your listeners, it's an alpha listed by state, but here's where North Carolina's edition begins in 1959. Of course, there's entries for Asheville. Charlotte, by far, has the most number of entries of all the Green Books cumulative over the years. I think it's 53 to your researchers.
It is
50, okay. And then Durham, obviously a lot of those places were in historic Hayti in that area, where Highway 147 now goes through Durham. And then there's Fayetteville, which also has a traditionally large, vibrant African-American and community of color. And of course, Greensboro. These areas down there are near where North Carolina A&T State University is currently located. And then there's Greenville, North Carolina, and Kinston, North Carolina, which has a very, that's a majority black city and has a very significant older black populace. So let's see, we flip it over. Kings Mountain. This is a smaller town located outside of Winston-Salem. Lumberton, which is a tri-racial community in many respects, Indian, black and white. And then of course there's Raleigh. And let's see, probably the most viable place here in Raleigh was the Hargett Street business district down what used to be called the Leitner Arcade. And that area was created by Mr. C.E. Leitner, who is the founder of Leitner Funeral Home back in 1911 here in Raleigh. And so that district of Hargett Street downtown near Moore Square and the current transportation hub is where this area was around, going back down toward Cabarrus Street and Shaw University.
Interesting.
And as you round it out, we have places. Here's Pinehurst down in Moore County. Of course, Rocky Mount would have been located at the old 301, which was the older north-south route before there was Interstate 95. And then, of course, Interstate 95 comes in the 1960s, and Rocky Mount is right at the junction there of Highway 64 and 301 and 95. Wow. So that's a very good place to be. And Statesville, same way, located on this Interstate 77.
Yeah.
There, and as you go down, places, Whiteville down in the southeastern part of the state, Columbus County, Windsor, Bertie County, which is another majority black county. And then of course Winston-Salem, my hometown. I actually knew some of these places downtown and in that area.
Oh, interesting.
Winston-Salem, and then Wilmington, which has a very large and old black demographic, African American, and dates back 2 centuries in Wilmington.
This is so fascinating. So my next question for y'all is also from Jessica. She had just a bevy of very interesting questions. And it is, how did folks go about getting Green Books? What was the primary way that people would receive them or purchase them?
You could purchase them primarily at SL gas stations. And so fairly early on in the late 30s and 40s, there was a partnership that was formed. Particularly, there was 2 African Americans who worked with that particular company and really worked with Victor Green in promoting and pushing the Green Books through those avenues. And so oftentimes at Esso gas stations, you could also write to Victor Green and receive a Green Book that way. And then there's also, of course, your traditional networking. Someone has it, they'll give you one, hand you one. So there are several different ways, often through quote-unquote grapevine, if you will, that you could receive one. It is to officially formally through the Esso gas stations.
Interesting.
And you can see this 1959 version cost $1.25. So worth a little bit more today.
Oh, for sure.
And along that line, any patrons or any of your listeners or viewers, if you know of anyone who might have experiences during segregated travel or may have artifacts, documents, photos like this, we would be more than happy to talk about having those in the museum collection.
That would be great. And Natalie, that's more of what you are focused on with Green Book Project is collecting things from others as well as going to these places that are featured in the book. Is that correct?
My responsibility is going to these locations and photographing them for preservation purposes and so that we can tell the story for each site. But that doesn't mean they're still standing. A lot of them, are demolished and they're no longer existing. So what we're doing basically at this point is we know what's existing, what's demolished, and we know there's certain addresses that are unknown. We are going in archives. We are looking into directories to verify addresses. I'm going out and talking to community members while I'm going out and photographing. I am asking about, what do you know about East Market Street in Greensboro? And I've had some very colorful conversations with individuals. But yes, I do a lot of research within the library, but I'm also out in the community gathering a lot of information too, which is very important to our project as well.
Yeah, gosh, and so interesting getting those parallels back into the history of this book and how it is today. And wow, just incredible work that you're doing and that you've been doing for the past few months for sure. So my next question, this is a question from yours truly, is these books, what was the, what am I trying to say? How often would these, when new Green Books come out for people to get new copies of? Every year? So I'm assuming there would be new businesses, new institutions that would, one, appear that would maybe have not been there last year, and two, would want to do business with the Green Book. So could anybody speak to the process for prioritizing which businesses or institutions were in the book, or the process for doing the research or communicating with the businesses to get themselves into the book every year?
So what happened? So the first edition of the Green Book primarily focused on just New York and the metropolitan area, and over time it grew. I believe eventually the last edition was something like 180 some pages.
Wow.
And of course over time as you begin it, so this was a business also for Victor Green in a way. So of course over time things expand, grow, change. So initially it was by word of mouth. Oftentimes. As people traveling, as people encountered the Green Book, I believe in later editions there's also a slip of paper in the back where you could send in recommendations of businesses to include in the next year's edition. And so that's one of the ways in how the Green Book in and of itself as a publication grew over time would be as individuals made submissions, oftentimes by mail, sometimes it is by phone. That's one of the things that as we're researching we think about is the ways in how if you have like a bad connection on the phone, how easy it is to misunderstand what the business name is. Because there have been several businesses, as I talk to community, they're not like, I don't know about that one, but there's one that's a close similar name to that other way, and so finding out, that way. And so that was one way, through by word of mouth. You can submit by mail, you can call in, but then in later years, Victor Green and later his wife actually, wife and an all-female staff published were responsible for some of the later editions of the Green Book, and they would contract and they would reach out to travel agents at times and have those kind of connections, and also solicit various businesses. And so in later years, you would get the purchasing of ads by different businesses, and if you can flip through, you'll see it more of a quarter page and full page size ads, kind of like on this side that you see on the Green Book.
And the staff that Lisa just spoke about, you can see is listed here, and his wife is at the bottom.
Oh,
And so very tight knit, obviously,
Excuse me.
glove type of staff. It appears.
yeah.
So, and again, revolutionary in of itself, all female staff.
It was
Amazing.
in later years after Mr. Green stepped down. I believe it was 1952. He had to, quasi retire. His wife picked up publication. It was an all-female staff who were responsible for getting several of the later editions out. And there was a multitude, a bevy of a flurry of activity as far as getting public listings in. And as you mentioned, not every business that appears in the Green Book appear continuously. So we have some businesses that may be included in, say, the 1947 edition, but they may not reappear again until like 1955. Now, why is that? We don't know, but that's something we're thinking about and trying to see if we can find the answer to that. And so not all businesses were in there consecutively throughout, but then you do have some businesses like Space Auto in Durham, where they have they're listed for almost 10 years continuously. So sometimes I would venture to say that something may have to be maybe a difference of whether it was submitted by a person. Like, say, I know this restaurant that's a good place for someone, versus maybe a business that's very intentional in trying to use the Green Book as a way to market, advertise, bring business to themselves. So there are many different factors and parameters to kind of think about. And if you were to transport yourself back in time, whether you're a traveler yourself and you want to share information, or if you're a business person, you're like, okay, this makes business sense, and how you use the Green Book.
You're right. This is important to note, is that there's a black middle class of professionals, particularly here in North Carolina, and as she indicated, out of New York City when this originates, that are networking and using this to go to Durham, the Black Wall Street, and Charlotte and Winston-Salem, and places that there are viable economic communities that are going on. And so this catered in large part to that black middle class. And so you may find some places that we know of that were established that didn't necessarily advertise. For example, all of Hayti is not in there. Well, we know that you can go to Hayti if you're a traveler, or to East Winston-Salem, or to one of these places where you know this is an already established black community, you might know. But if you are not from there, you travel in particular from out of state as a professional middle class, then you're going to rely on that more so. So it really augmented that, but that black middle class is really what emerges also during this time from 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, especially here in North Carolina.
Interesting, and that makes a lot of sense considering the height of the middle class was around that time for all races, and
Yes.
that was definitely the chance for people in the middle class to go out and take advantage of all of those roads that were just newly built for everyone. So yeah, gosh,
That's
so
the very
interesting.
expression of American freedom, to get on the road
That's
and
right.
go. Like, that's what we're enjoying this Thanksgiving. So many people on the road going on this travel vacation, so to speak.
Yeah.
But we take that for granted. now,
Absolutely.
right? And that not only the safety of those folks who are out there monitoring 24/7. Those public safety officials, but in addition to having those safe roads and places to go, those types of places are modern amenities. They're not necessarily the types of amenities that you would find in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. You might go very long distances. I remember before there was 40 between Winston-Salem and Raleigh, it was a much longer time frame than just going on 40
Yeah.
and that hour and a half to 2 hour drive now. So it was a little bit longer time frame. You packed your patience, right? And you just moved to your destinations.
Yeah.
And you kind of plotted your journey really more meticulously than we have the luxury and comfort of jumping in our smart vehicles and just going today.
Sure, absolutely. Gosh, so interesting, and like you said, very different from the way things are now. So another question for y'all is, talk to me a little bit about, take me step by step through, somebody who at this point in time maybe had access to this particular copy of the Green Book. Say a traveler was going to look through something, they would open this book up. Where would you start? Where would you know where to look for the things that you're looking for? Does that make sense?
Well, I would say first thing is, you want to get gas. You got to get gas.
Yeah.
I was talking to one of my older relatives who went to college in Tennessee, to Tennessee State from Winston-Salem, and we're talking about driving back and forth. and how she drove a Volkswagen Beetle and had to plot the gas stations where she stopped to refill for gas, knowing those as safe spaces as a young black female traveling alone during segregation era. I mean, that is something to really be thoughtful about. You know, you definitely don't want to go to the wrong gas station or to the wrong stop, and for obvious reasons. So that is probably number one, your gas and your food, kind of like today, you know, your gas and your food, although there are no, you know, sheets or places like that. You kind of have to string it along there. So, and then, of course, depending on if it's a day's journey or 2 days, you want to, of course, get a good night's rest. And alluding to the movie, there are some scenes in the movie that refer to almost the third-rate type of motel amenities, which obviously did exist, particularly in the black community. But it's important to note that there were these higher-end amenities and places that were for these professionals and young upstarts that were 20th century modern amenities with air conditioning, some of them advertising, things like that. So that's probably going to be your next step is, you know, if I have to have an overnight journey, in addition to gas, I want to make sure that I have a safe place where I can rest and get a good cup of coffee and get going the next day.
I would also add to that, not only just identifying, but making your reservations ahead of time. In many editions of the Green Book, they included essays, and that was one of the things they recommended, making sure that you call ahead, you have everything in place, so that when you arrive, you know, you can help reduce some of the anxiety.
In fact, that's part of the instruction in the foreword. It advises the travelers to have reservations, and it says, you know, information about how to travel in the foreword. So this is really a travel guide in every sense.
Step.
Yes.
And I would also like to incorporate that with the Green Book, especially as it gained popular. There are other travel guides for African Americans as well, but the Green Book happened to be the one that lasted the longest in publication and could be also the most well known. But I say that also that many of your major serial publications, such as like the Chicago Defender, Ebony magazine, Jet magazine, they eventually started including travel sections in there as well. So some of this information that you see in some of the essays in the travel in the Green Book, you also see in other places as well, especially as a travel culture is emerging within the African American community.
That's especially right. I remember growing up in the 70s, we had Jet magazine along that line. And Jet magazine is almost the same size as this. And so it's almost like a pocket book, literally.
So people had multiple things to multiple resources to use when they were out traveling, not just the Green Book,
Yes.
but definitely the most popular.
And I think, Earl, we might want to mention something about the economics of travel and racial segregation. Do you believe we might have a question regarding to if venues admitted both races but segregated them inside?
Well, that is a good point. Yes. Recently, I have to give a plug for our museum. We have the Ernie Barnes exhibit, North Carolina Roots of Ernie Barnes, and he's a Durham native, world famous Ernie Barnes, and his birthday party was this past July in Durham, and I had the opportunity to go, and retiring Representative Mickey Mishaw gave a story. He knew Ernie Barnes, and the Sugar Shack is based on the Durham Armory, that famous painting. And so Representative Mishaw told a story about how that was segregated, but the white patrons had to sit in the balcony in that particular instance, which in reverse, in many majority white venues, it was the reverse where people of color, patrons of color, would usually have to sit in that. So you have those types of reverse segregation. But also along that line, I was making a point to someone last week, just travel in general and the way Jim Crow and segregation was set up, it made it illegal, a crime, for an example, you and me, Emily, to talk equally here. That was against the laws of segregation, and you or I, or both, would pay the legal ramifications for that. Well, if you were traveling in a vehicle and you and I were traveling, that would likely be cause for me to be lynched.
Oh.
Okay, because that was against the social mores of Jim Crow and segregation. If a white and a person of color were traveling together, the person of color was supposed to be in the rear or in the truck bed.
Oh.
And not in the front or in the passenger with the white person. And so if we take the Montgomery bus boycotts, that really made that dynamic, because those women who were working in that bus boycott were boycotting the bus system, but those white ladies needed that help, so they would drive and pick them up and make a scene with them in the front seat, driving back through Montgomery, Alabama, which was against their segregation laws too. So these segregation laws become customs, right? And so the laws are no longer on the book, but the customs of people riding together, different races, is something that I want our modern motorists to understand, not to take for granted, that is breaking a segregated law and custom just by virtue of riding together side by side if you're of different races. So that is one of the dangers of travel also. And as I mentioned, sundown towns and places like that, we have those types of towns here in North Carolina. The Green Book movie has a North Carolina scene in Raleigh, and it's a very good scene. The artist is asked to go to the outhouse in the intermission of the concert. Now, I'm still studying where this venue could have possibly been in Raleigh in the 1962 time frame. My thoughts are somewhere around the Carolina Country Club area of Glenwood Avenue, which would have been probably the most prominently developed area of Raleigh at that time. But he was asked to go to the outhouse, and he refused, but instead went to his hotel 30 minutes away in the movie, which in that instance, if it had been at that Carolina Country Club, could have either been in Durham, which would have been the Durham Highway, Old 70 Highway going back to Haytop, or it would have taken up to 30 minutes to get back to Hargett Street area of Raleigh if he was going back to his area there. So that was a plausible part of the movie, and there was also a Stuckey's in there. So if you're an old North Carolina person, you remember Stuckey's, which was there. But he leaves there and goes out to Georgia and in Augusta, and is refused service to purchase a suit, to actually try on a suit before purchasing it. So those types of things that we take for granted, being able to just go in the store, try something on if you're traveling, or this was an actual tailor who was white in this instance. And so he refused to tailor service to a black patron at that time, and lost that business. And so these are the types of things economically that contributed to the breakdown of Jim Crow segregation, because it did not make economic sense to do these types of things. We have another exhibit at the museum now called Collecting Carolina. We have a white and colored door. And the way that I curated it is to make the doors talk. And they're basically asking, why do we have one pipe and two sets of ladies going in two different doors, and they're using the same water? And the doors are, and so that, in the words of the late John Hope Franklin, is ludicrous on its head, Jim Crow and segregation. And you know, our public amenities were required per our 1875 Constitution in North Carolina to mandate in public amenities segregation and Jim Crow, and made it illegal for white and people of color to come together as equals. I mean, made it a crime. And these crimes put people on the real chain gangs to build railroads and modern roads all the way up through the 1930s. So, you know, this Jim Crow was a real reality that in many instances, older patrons who we deal with at the museum still reflect and share some of those many times painful memories. But as a historian and curator, we want to collect those items, that information, and hopefully partner it with an artifact, document, and photograph like this Green Book, and create what's called a provenance for a historical asset or historical artifact. In other words, the words of the patron or the words of the person who owns that document being able to give exactly what it was. And so in this particular artifact, this is a lender who is a collector who purchased this, so he didn't actually use this. So there's a difference in the provenance versus if I find a patron who's 80 or 90 years young who says, hey, Mr. Imes, I have a Green Book that I use from Rocky Mount to Raleigh. Yes. So that's a provenance, and that's the type of story that goes behind an artifact that really gives it that wow factor.
Interesting. So such good insights and knowledge into that, and all the more importance for this during that era. Gosh, So interesting. And thank you so much, Clark, for your question. I hope we answered it and did it justice. So does anyone have any final thoughts while we wrap this up? Anything that you definitely wanted to cover about this Green Book that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet?
Well, I'd like to invite everyone to look out for our upcoming African American Cultural Celebration at the North Carolina Museum of History. It's one of the largest indoor activities, particular for African American, for everyone, obviously, but it celebrates African American history and culture. And so the patron who owns this Green Book is going to be presenting in our History, Film, and Enterprise segment, and not only about this particular artifact, but he has a wide array of artifacts and documents and photos that he's going to share, along with a lot of other special guests and presenters. And come early and get a good seat, because we can get up to 10,000 strong on that day at the museum. But it's a wonderful event, and we're very fortunate to have this on loan through the African American Heritage Commission and the project, the Green Book Project, working in concert with the Commission. This has just been a really good project working in conjunction between the two entities.
And I would like to reinforce something that Earl had mentioned earlier about the work that we're doing to document the stories. You know, the Green Book only really provides a snapshot into what it was like to travel for African Americans and some of the businesses. So it's actually two stories that are working in concert here when you look at an artifact like the Green Book. And so I definitely would like to make sure that our viewers know that you can reach out to the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, and that we are looking to connect with community members who can either talk about what it was like to travel to navigate spaces during racial segregation, whether that might be around one's hometown, whether it might be from one part of the state to another, or if it might be going through North Carolina to other states or destinations. And additionally, you know, there are many African American businesses in which travelers would have encountered during this time period that we're focusing on. And so also community members have information or remember some of the prominent businesses within many of our African American communities across the states. We would love to connect with you that way also, to be able to not only document stories, but also if anyone has any pictures, images, objects that will allow us to really to talk about the story that's presented by the Green Book, that of both African American travel as well as African American entrepreneurship during racial segregation. And you can reach out to the African American Heritage Commission. Our web address is https://aahc.nc.gov. And so that is our website. And then when you go to our website, there is a contact us feature, and we can receive messages that way. Mm-hmm.
Well, and again, the film is outstanding. As a historian, I critiqued it from historical perspective, and it got all the checks, and that's a rarity for Hollywood, I think, from a historical perspective. But also from a cinematography, the mise-en-scenes, just the entire way the film is written and produced is top-notch, and the acting is out of sight. So, but again, Dr. Don Shirley is one of these black middle-class professionals. He's a classically trained pianist who back then would not be categorized as such, because that type of professional was not allowed during segregation, so he was constantly pegged as a jazz musician, which there is a difference, not to denigrate jazz musician, but he's a classically trained Dr. Shirley, pianist. And then Tony Lip, his sidekick and chauffeur, is an outstanding actor too, and his son provided a lot of the screenplay for the film.
Oh, interesting.
And so my hopes are to see those actual manuscripts, so we can determine if that was in fact the Carolina Country Club where he was in Raleigh, or that we do need to do a little bit more investigation.
Yeah.
Yes.
You answered my final question, Earl. Say, does the movie do this book justice and the history of this book? And I'm really glad to hear that it does. So.
I think so. I think people will be very intrigued with the information and the subtleties of the film and learning about that, and not so our distant history. But again, if you're a history of film, the cinematography and the acting is top notch, and I would expect some Oscars to come out of this. And that's kind of, I mean, that's how
Heard it here first,
that's how I
friends.
talk. But there's some very wonderful acting, and the clothes, and that I mentioned there, Stuckies. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, thank you all so much for coming here to talk to me and give myself and the viewers at home just some incredible information to supplement this movie, and just to walk away with just, like you said, Earl, just not taking for granted the amazing privileges that we all have today, and taking time to reflect on these just this really important time in history, and having artifacts here to show people to help complement what we are learning about this. Gosh, it is just so incredible, and I thank you all so much for coming, and I thank you all at home so much for being here and joining us. We cannot wait to go see this movie. I think that's what I'm going to do this weekend with my family for Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Thank you all again so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.